Well, before we begin, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the program. We prepared this for the history conference in Sydney last fall, and we got so carried away picking images that we have quite a few, over 100 slides. And so we don't dwell on each slide. We go by pretty quickly. So if you see an image that you like and you think you'd like to see more of it, the collection is, of course, in the photo archives, and you're welcome to come and look at the whole collection. But we just wanted to warn you. I know a lot of people go, "Oop, that was a good view," and it's gone.
Too fast, too gone. Yeah.
But there will be more opportunities if you see an image you like. And we could certainly, even later tonight, after the talk, we'll answer questions. And then if there's a particular image you want to see, we could always go back to it. So Becca and I are here this evening to introduce you to two remarkable Danish men, Henry and Edgar Syverud, who lived and worked in Sheridan County most of their lives. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to tell you first about Henry and Edgar's scrapbooks and how we came to have them at the Society and to realize the remarkable treasures they contained. Henry and Edgar Syverud compiled a total of 4 scrapbooks, illustrated mainly with Edgar's photographs. Henry donated the first 2 scrapbooks to the Society in 1941 and the last 2 scrapbooks in 1968. All 4 scrapbooks were stored in the library's lockup case until 1979 when they were transferred to the archives, where they were cataloged as Small Collection 1504. The photographs were eventually removed and separated to the Photograph Archives. During the years we've worked in the photo archives, Becca and I have often shown researchers the Syverud photographs because we knew they contained interesting views of farming in northeastern Montana and the drought years in the 1930s. However, until we decided to prepare this talk, we had never really read the writings by the Syverud brothers in the scrapbooks or compared them to the photographs. In the Syverud archival collection are not only the scrapbooks compiled by Edgar and Henry, but also a reminiscence of Henry's experiences in Montana from 1915 until 1929. The scrapbooks contain photographs with detailed descriptions, reminiscences from 1909 to 1965, and also biographical sketches of many of the pioneers who were neighbors of the Syveruds in northeastern Montana. These biographical sketches alone would be of interest to people searching for genealogical information about family members who homesteaded in the northeastern part of Montana. And you can actually see at the very bottom of this page of one of the scrapbooks a biographical sketch. And there's some great ones in there, and I think it would be nice if they were indexed, but I don't think there is a listing of the actual biographies of the other people besides the Syveruds. Today, Becca and I will be taking turns describing in somewhat chronological order Henry and Edgar's lives in eastern Montana. And we're only going to talk about the years from 1909 until 1940. They actually lived until the 1960s. But we, like I said, got a little carried away picking images already, so we will use Edgar's photographs to illustrate and sometimes Henry's actual descriptions for the photographs from the scrapbooks. Becca also will be adding quotes from the brothers' prose and poetry in the scrapbooks as they describe firsthand the events in their lives and their philosophies toward life, work, history, and the future.
A brief message in between all of this recording material, and I'm quoting Henry here. A brief message in between all of this may be valued. There's not enough space to write many pioneer stories, nor about the struggles, the triumphs, failures, nor even can I record all who have taken part in any activity here as the years went by. We have material for 6 or more volumes of scrapbooks like these, but as the times are, it is fortunate that even as little a bit as these 2 volumes are available. Now remember, he's speaking from about 1939. It has been a real sacrifice of many very badly needed things to buy these prints during our period of severe droughts and extremely scant relief income. But time waits for no one, so I feel that this work must be done while the material is possible to get. There is an old Chinese proverb which tells in brief that each picture tells a story that thousands of words fail to convey meaning. My aim has been to illustrate every human interest activity with the proofs of authenticity, so you will have noted that I am photographed on most, thus establishing the connection, and dates are recorded as reliably as it is possible for humans to do. The purpose of these books is to provide the means to develop better understandings of each community and thereby make our nation a big brotherhood of tolerant people. In their scrapbooks, the Syveruds outlined 4 distinct periods in the development of their corner of the world. 1909 to 19 is the pioneer and development stage. 1919 to 25, the war-stimulated period. 25 to 30 are the days of grace, and the 1930 to 1940 unprepared for disaster period. We'll define and illustrate these stages as we proceed with our presentation.
So this is the opening cover page to one of the first albums, and we loved it because it was dedicated to their father and mother, Newt and Karina Syverud, and they'd moved west from Minnesota. So Edgar was born in 1885, Henry in 1887, and they were born in a sod house on a 160-acre farm just east of Osnabrück, North Dakota. So both boys were baptized early in the Lutheran faith, and they lived for their early years on the farm until their parents moved into Osnabrück. And this, in Osnabrück, is where his father was employed at a general merchandise store. So here we have their first home in Osnabrück. So once they left the farm, they moved into town. And there's another view of the house next to the Methodist Church in about 1895. So they also got their early education here. They went to elementary and high school in Osnabrück. And then we have a great photo of Edgar here with his camera and his bicycle. And Edgar actually continued his education at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, and he went there from 1902 to 1904. Henry also continued his education at the University of North Dakota, and he was there from 1904 to 1906. And here we have Henry and his roommate, Chris Torrent, studying away. And Henry makes little comments throughout the scrapbooks and in his biographical sketch, and here he talks about his education. I wanted to progress on to electrical engineering courses, but could not master algebra. So I became discouraged and took a brief course in bookkeeping instead. When I quit my studies, I tried out several employment opportunities. I started as a clerk at the Boehmer Mercantile Store in Osnabrück under the guidance of my father, who was employed there too. But Henry had a restless nature, so he traveled to Iowa and central North Dakota, but he couldn't find steady employment, so he decided to return home to northeastern North Dakota. So then he was employed at Kirkhorn and Langland General Merchants at Lankin, North Dakota. And you can see Henry here with the owner, George Langland, a traveling salesman and a clerk. And he worked here from July 1907 until January 1908. And then again he says his restless nature craved further changes, so he quit with a poor excuse, took a notion to travel up to northwest Canada, again found no employment, returned home. But then when he came home, he contracted a severe cold in his lungs and came down with pleurisy. But he pulled through with the help of friends and relatives. But he was idle, he said, for almost a year. So in the spring, several of his friends left for eastern Montana, where they were going to try homesteading. But he didn't know if the possibilities there were favorable yet, or if the area was open for settlement. So in the meantime, he'd been corresponding with a lady friend living in Glasgow. She wrote him about encouraging prospects there. So he saved his money, and then he left for Glasgow. And he arrived on the Great Northern Railroad, and for a week or so he worked at the railroad roundhouse. And when this was completed, he went to the land office for a few days and worked, and then he went and worked on a ranch for a couple months. But one of the ranch owners died, so he lost his job, returned to Glasgow, and took up his former job at the roundhouse. But then he realized that the smoke from the locomotives serviced in the roundhouse was affecting his health, so he resigned. He recalled, this gentleman is interested in everything, so then he remembered he was interested in the Flathead Indian Reservation being open for settlement. So he thought he'd go to the Flathead. So off he goes to the Flathead, and he arrives in Kalispell the next day. But unfortunately, on the trip, he caught a cold, sore throat, developed a severe case of tonsillitis. So he's discouraged again by getting sick, decides to take the train back to Minot, North Dakota, then to Flaxton, and west to Ambrose, North Dakota.
Henry recalls, the first period I shall call the pioneer and development stage. From 1909 until 1919, saw a great deal of construction and soil cultivation. A definite progress was seen in this transition from a raw state to a well-cultivated farm community and access to the many refinements of civilization.
So it's at this time that he visits friends who have established homesteads in Valley County, which later became Sheridan County, and Becca's pointing it out there on the map. And they call this the Coalridge country. So it was open to homestead entry, but most of the available land was already taken up. Through the efforts of his friends, he was able to find a half section still open, which he filed on immediately.
When I came out from Ambrose, North Dakota, and, well, you'll see it's right about there. When I came out from Ambrose, North Dakota, October 17th, 1909, I rode on a grain wagon with a brother of H.P. Henningsen and stopped overnight with them at their sod house after a journey that day of 35 miles. They lived a few miles from the post office named Fertile. Next day, I walked a few miles west to where I came to I.J. Torsky's farm. So here we are at the Torsky farm. Now, it seems like a big map. This is the state line. His little homestead is there, but each square is only a mile, so it's like within 10 miles.
But you can see all the homesteads, too.
I worked there at Torsky's during the regular farm work season, and I also worked for board during the winters. So until 1912 and 13, I made this my house, as I did not have the means or had enough developed on my homestead to stay there in Montana on my own. So there's the Torsky's home there in North Dakota. And he worked as a regular farmhand in the summer, and he would take something to Plentywood for the Torskys and stop by his place and pick some rocks and do some work. His neighbors, Henry and John Haven, had the bachelor headquarters. They were always welcome there at any hour. You can see it was close quarters, but in the pictures you see tents put up behind where people stayed. The neighbors are working away, and all of these neighbors helped each other with their plowing and with their different harvesting projects.
So here they are back at the Torskys, and this is the Norwegian Lutheran Ladies' Aid Society meeting here, and the gentleman joining in.
They were very social. They loved, and I suppose with all that big landscape out there, you wanted to be with people. But he goes to the Melbys, works with them. He and his friend Henry visit the Nicholsons. Doing work for others, I have, while taking in the threshing seasons from 1910 to 1920, worked on every place almost in the district. Eastwards to Fertile, north to Westby, thence west to Coalridge, and to farms a mile south of Brush Lake. I've slept overnight and eaten meals on each farm, so I really got acquainted with almost everything in this area. He built a shack on the place and made progress slowly, step by step. The shack was built in 1 hour's time on the highest hill on the southwest quarter. Credit is due to Andrew Dahl, Ben Berger, Ole Boe, and Johannes Evensen, who helped him on April Fool's Day, 1910.
And he talks a lot about hauling rocks, and so he mentions that this cart was used for hauling rocks too. And then they also used it to break up his first 6-acre field together. So as Becca said, they were always helping each other with their different work. And here's a great shot of Henry grinding coffee for dinner. So he's in his own little place now.
Now this is Henry Haven's well being dug, but Henry Syverud has this to say about his own well. The well was bored in the spring of 1917, was curbed at a depth of 50 feet. The water was fairly good and soft water for several years, but eventually after heavy uses of the increasing livestock raising needs, the well water became contaminated from the coal deposits at or near the depth of the well. This brought in a kind of iron mineral which deposited itself on metal containers, making a lining of a rust-like coating. Also, alkali and sodium was washed in, so the water became harder and less desirable as time went on. Quicksand was washed in, and so we had to slush out the quicksand at different periods by means of a special slush bucket made for this purpose. Sometimes the water would have small lumps and grains of lignite coal, which were pumped up.
Great. Well, we love this because, again, water is an issue.
And coal is an issue.
And there's all this discussion about water and, you know, how it wasn't very pure and difficult, and it was a big effort to keep your well pure. So here we have Henry's shack in 1911, and you can see his brother Edgar is also in the photo helping to build on the shanty. Henry called his homestead the Two Triangles Farm because he found 2 large triangular-shaped rocks as he cleared his land. And he'd always been interested in odd rock specimens.
And this is a spoiler alert for archaeologists. Henry later writes regarding the 2 triangle rocks and the teepee rings, "I regret that I did not leave the formations as I found them for further study, but the fact of such study did not even enter my mind. Thus, other stone outline patterns may have been in evidence before being disturbed for cultivation purposes of the area. Lost to our present civilization are these local records."
So here we have him digging up rocks and trying to get ready to cultivate his land. And he talks about breaking up his acreage with steam rigs that he hired. So he had over 80 acres in cultivation when he finally proved up on his homestead in 1914. And the interesting thing was this acreage was rented out on shares. So here he is with his flax crop and his hay fields in the background. And again, more hauling rocks. His friends, there's a lot of rock hauling. And this is John Hansen threshing his late flax. And Becca noted that the date was December 2nd, 1912, which seems a little late.
For a crop?
For threshing, we didn't expect that.
The weather was different then.
Yeah. So, and of course, you have all the farm work to do, but you still have to wash your clothes and take care of things around your homestead. So here he is showing off his newly washed clothes. In the meantime, Henry's brother Edgar had decided to take up a homestead in Dawson County, a county that was later divided, and the part where Edgar had located became Garfield County. Edgar had started to build up his homestead during the summer of 1913, so he shipped out a carload of household goods together with stock and some equipment to Sumatra, Montana, to begin his new venture. So here we have Edgar's immigrant car, and Nels, another brother, and Henry are on the loaded wagon.
Nels, their brother 12 years older, and Alice, their youngest sister, and Henry all went to Garfield County on the train to help Edgar establish his homestead.
And this is an interesting photo because you can see them by the little tent in the foreground, and they say they're building a shed for the storage of goods and equipment in Sumatra until they can haul it out to Edgar's homestead. And then here they are working on Edgar's homestead. Henry's breaking the sod, and you can see that little house and the outbuildings in the background. And this one, the same, he's more breaking of the sod, more Henry on the plow, And he mentions the shack and the barn were moved further west to the sheltered side hill. And here we have Henry hauling hay from the creek bottoms.
Henry always thought that the big dry country was more suitable for grazing than farming due to the nutritional value of the native grasses. These grasses were very short compared to the slough grass in Sheridan County, but it had a very high food content for the animals.
And there's a nice picture of their vegetables that they grew, and corn, squash, and potatoes grown on Edgar's homestead. But of course, Henry had his own homestead to worry about, so here he is on his way into the town of Sumatra, and he's leaving Edgar's homestead to go to his own, and he's headed for Dagmar.
Road winds over gumbo, bear paw shale, with plenty of sagebrush. Note the distant haze, like you read of in Zane Grey's novels. Even as though they're living in this tough life, they're just thinking how romantic it is to be out here.
So then we have his, go ahead.
Well, although he had leased his farm out on shares, Henry went back to help with the very first wheat crop on his own land. Later, he returns to winter with Edgar, Nels, and Alice at Edgar's homestead in Garfield County.
So he mentions that his first wheat crop, cropland was rented to W. Armstrong. And then here's Edgar's house before they built the sod up around it. So, you know, definitely the little tar paper shack on the homestead for sure. And this is when it's looking a little bit more prosperous. The buildings from left to right are the barn, the chicken coop, and the granary. And there's his sister Alice is feeding the chickens. And he mentions that the cedar posts in the foreground were hauled from the Mussel Shell river breaks. So they didn't find that close by.
See, there's not a lot of treeage out here. This is Allen's Mine near Sand Springs. It's a coal mine. As many of the Garfield County homesteads were treeless tracts, homesteaders dug for coal for their household use. Later, just east of his own spring, Edgar found such a coal bed, which he used for the last year of his inhabitants in Garfield County.
And this he mentions as the corn crop of 1914 on the northeast quarter. And Edgar's holding the tub of husked corn, and they said they husked the field during the winter of 1914 and 15, which looks like cold work. And then you can also see Edgar's farm buildings in the background. So.
Wouldn't want that field too close to the house.
Here we show Edgar and Sister Alice driving to a party at the neighbor's place. So they, again, were sociable. They liked to do things and get out. And this is when Henry's spending the winter of 1914 and 15 with his brothers at Edgar's homestead.
Just have to say they go out to a party and have so much fun, and they're dancing, and then they spend the night, but then they come back, but then Henry has to go get on the train. So they all get on the train with him and go for half a day's journey, and then he goes on and they come back to Sumatra. It's just, there's not that much to do in the winter, I guess. However, my brother and sister did have enough of the isolation and lack of convenient neighbors and town trading facilities, so we're happy to plan in coming up to my homestead in Sheridan County and help me build my homestead and farm. So with spring, Henry returned to Sheridan County, and Edgar and the others stayed on the homestead in Garfield County only one more summer.
In 1915, Henry invested in a kerosene-burning tractor and broke up more sod so he could sow in more crops. It was called it was made by Hart Parr, and it was called the Little Devil Kerosene Tractor.
Of one of his trips home, Henry tells us, I bought the Little Devil in May of 1915. Hans Sneva and Ole Stenderson came over to see the outfit perform. And it so happened that I was breaking a strip between some hills. At the bottom was a turtleback pothole where the plows would often take up a thick furrow, making the tractor slow down and force the front end up in the air like a bronco rearing up with its hind legs with the front legs pawing the air. But in the case of this tractor, I had added more weight with the old boiler full of rocks. So you can see this. Here's the old boiler full of rocks. This had been filled with concrete at the factory for extreme pulls on the drawbar. As usual, when these rearing performances started, I just stepped off and pushed the tractor back on its front wheels with only small efforts. These men had been operating the large steam tractors which never reared up, so when the tension was relieved by the tractor resuming its proper position, they did laugh with the keenest of enjoyment. So you saw those big steam things. Here's this little guy.
By 1916, Edgar was disappointed because
Go ahead.
he was disappointed because access to the railroad had not improved in Garfield County. So he decided to sell his homestead. At this time, he also sold his horses and wagons to Henry, and in the fall of 1916 drove the horses and wagons across from Sand Springs in Garfield County to Henry's homestead in Sheridan County. So here we have them in Sydney. They're moving from Sand Springs to East Coalridge, and Nels and Alice and Edgar have stopped for noon just to have lunch, I guess. And this overland trip that they took from Sand Springs in Garfield County, they went through Jordan, Lambert, Sydney, Mondack, and then north cross country up to Henry's. And we drove there just, last fall, and the whole time I'm thinking, what? They just went back and forth so often as if it was nothing, but it was quite a distance between those two homesteads.
Then in the late October of 1916, my brothers and sister did drive up to my homestead with the 2 wagons and 2 teams pulling them. They had along only some small keepsakes, clothing, furniture, 2 or 3 chairs. Shortly after their coming, we hauled over some lumber to a new site, southwest of where my shacks were then located, upon a hillside closer to the main road. Building up a 1.5-story frame house after building a concrete foundation for it. The weather did favor us for a long time, so we were prepared for the winter when it did eventually come. Also built up a lumber stable for the horses, bought some cows and chickens in due time, and were prepared to operate the farm for the following season, together with the small Hunt Par tractor, which I had purchased in the spring of 1915.
So here we have Henry doing some winter chores. He's fanning seed grain, and this is the winter of 16 and 17. And he notes there's no shelter for the little devil in the background.
He loved that tractor.
And here we have him hauling manure again in the winter.
And so do you think that's where he's dumping it? I mean, that's a big pile of something.
Yeah.
Might be hay, I don't know.
Oh, let's hope hay. Huh? And then more, spring comes and more breaking sod with horses, and they're sowing flax.
The second period, 1919 to 1925, may be called the war-stimulated period, with its inflated prices. This period saw rapidly made incomes, more investments, and an ever-mounting desire to take greater and greater chances on making more and still more.
We've kind of tucked these little postage stamp-sized portraits of Edgar and Henry in here, but they put them throughout the scrapbooks. So you open a little page and there'll be their little faces up in the corner. But I think they just enjoyed the whole experience of working on the scrapbooks too. And again, as Becca mentioned, they like to be social, and here we have them motorboating. Who knew? Boating on Brush Lake in about 1919. So it wasn't all work. There was also time for social gatherings with friends and neighbors.
The most notable gatherings would be at the Brush Lake Resort, where celebrations became a must for nearly everyone in the entire region on Sundays. So on the map, this is
Right
Brush
down there.
Lake. So not far from Dagmar, not far from Henry's place.
And again, not far from North Dakota. So this is North Dakota Governor Lynn Frazier was speaking at Brush Lake. And look at all the cars.
The number of people assembling there increased manyfold, and in comparison, sometimes had 50 cars where before was 1 horse and buggy. A new era had developed in earnest, and together with the building of railroads closer to us, soon changed our lives for larger responsibilities and for a larger scale of farming.
Another social activity, here they're picking choke cherries in the sand hills, and we have Nels and Henry in the photo. Never passed up an opportunity to do things with their neighbors. And we like this photo just because it shows that he's getting more settled. This is Henry's home. And, you know, he's got even tablecloth on the table, and he's got an organ and a little, looks like a radio or a
Gramophone.
Gramophone, yeah. So just looks like he's settling in.
The East Coalridge Community Club, which my brother Edgar organized with the assistance of neighbors in 1919, was disorganized in 1929 when we joined up with the local Farmers Union as the East Coalridge Local Farmers Union number 73. I was elected to serve as secretary and treasurer for several years in the club, and when we organized the local Farmers Union, I was elected to serve and have served as the secretary and treasurer to this date. From the many experiences, I can record valuable historical events of community interests. So here they are, another couple of Scandinavian farmers living out there, have this nice welcome for the club party.
This is one of our favorites. This is Nell Syverud in his prize-winning Indian costume. And you can see he won a shaving set for his costume. This is Grenora, North Dakota in 1922. And he does say that the Indian costume was such a popular winner at masquerade dances in many communities in both Montana and North Dakota.
And it looks so authentic, doesn't it? It was not all fun and prosperity. There were occasional blank years as well as good crops. That's what Henry keeps calling them. It's a blank year. Here you can see the whole crop. 1921 is hailed out, and the sloughs are all full of water. Even with the loss of crops, there were still cattle and slough grass to get him through. In the summer of 1919, I purchased a windmill from the lumber yard at Grenora, North Dakota. They were the dealers of the tip-top make of all steel windmills. This tower and windmill is still up, though only used infrequently at this writing in 1957. So from 1919 to 1957, he's using this windmill.
And he does talk a little bit about the cattle, too. He says he purchased cattle separately at auction sales, and they cost between $65 and $85. But in 1923, he was forced to sell them for $25 to $30, so he took a loss. And another wonderful photo that shows, they talk about Russian thistles quite a bit, especially later on in the drought years. And this farmyard fence is full of Russian thistles. And this is 1922 when things are good. But it was really hard on the fences because those thistles would pile up. So I just think that it's a great photo for that. And of course, there they are plowing again.
All these horses, you know, feeding them and taking care of them and finding a place for them to stay. It caused quite a bit of extra work. But look at that, isn't that gorgeous? They, before they had the combines, the little combines that could get close to different places, they harvested it all at the same time. So there was green stuff and ripe stuff, well, grain. And they didn't have granaries, so they just piled it on the ground for it to dry out.
And this is a nice view of the oat crop north of the slough on the west quarter on Henry's farm.
It's just magnificent.
So you can see he's having some prosperous years, and there's his little house and the outbuildings. So Alice kept house for her brothers, and then she decided to get married. And so in 1922, she married and moved to Minot, North Dakota. And Nels, we think at this time too, we're not sure, but Nels, as we said, was 12 years older, and he died in 1925, so in Minot, North Dakota. So we think at some point then he probably followed Alice to Minot and lived with her until he died.
George and Oliver Ness had both brought their big steam outfits out to help Henry with plowing and with breaking up the land. They were for hire out of Grenora, North Dakota, so that's obviously where Alice met Oliver.
And then they talked about how they had to batch after Alice was gone.
How do you like that? Yeah.
It does look like a lot of work. They probably really missed Alice.
I think so.
And we love this little slide because it says Ray McKay and his new wife, and they talk about this Mrs. Haven in the center, and they said this is the East Coalridge Community Club, and she was always championing the rest of the bachelors to do likewise, get married. So there she is in the middle.
So as we were preparing for this, I saw this picture and I thought, well, the East Coalridge Club must be doing something special, but I couldn't tell what was on the banner, so I got my loop out and I looked real close. And I didn't quite get what I was reading, so I got the narrative out and started reading. And Henry says, Edgar thought he would make a song. He composed a nice song for the East Coalridge Community Club to sing, and they would all sing it, and then they would toast, and I'm just gonna sing. A little tune came to my head when I heard that, and these are his words. I have a secret I will tell. I like my pie, I like my pie. Of all good things that cast a spell, I like my pie, I like my pie. Its memories dear I love to dwell, its sweet appeal to taste and smell. Of all my joys there's none so well. I like my pie, I like my pie. Yes, I do. And you can see, they're toasting with pie. They're all holding up their pie. Just like, I mean, these guys are so much fun, this whole community.
And then here we have them having more fun. They're on the shores of Medicine Lake with fish they caught for dinner. And he does mention that people from all points of Sheridan County enjoyed eating the fish taken from the waters of this lake. But then he also says several years later, during the drought, the fish had apparently died out due to low water levels and bad conditions. And then when we were in eastern Montana this fall, we found out that now again this particular lake is a U.S. migratory bird refuge and a reclamation site. So that was kind of good news. And here we have a Lillian Ness, which is Alice's little girl. She's back, she's out at the homestead visiting her uncles. And there's the chickens and the dog Trixie.
In the winters of 1922 and 23, Henry attended the Coyne Electrical School in Chicago. Although at 34 he was too old to be hired by his employers of choice, Henry found that the training did help in later years. A practical use that I made was to induce my neighbors to invest in farm telephones, and I offered to connect these up to the barbed wire fences. This was all donated work, but some extras, such as insulation, lead-covered cables placed under the road crossings, and some extra lengths of wires and poles, were met by the neighbors. The only cost was in replacing the 2 batteries in each phone and the time that it took to repair the part of fence line that the phone circuit was on. We had 8 phones in our circuit, and it worked good until after many years of service, some of the neighbors grew careless about keeping their fences in good repair, so the line grounded too often. I never did charge for my time for repairing the lines for the many years of service, but the indifference of the neighbors in repairing their fences finally stopped my efforts. So isn't that clever? And you know, this is 1923. The real phone came there in 1964. So there's like quite a time span in between.
And how inventive they were to come up with their own ways to have a phone. So they were always trying to make a little extra money. So here we have Edgar in a Ford truck they purchased at Westby in the fall of 1923, and they use this for custom hauling. And this is just another view of threshing, which
The Stonersons, well, Dahl and Stonerson, would bring their own cook car with them. So that's what this is over here. And wrong button, quick. You can see a mirror and a washstand. You want to get cleaned up before you cook or before you eat. But all the neighbors are always helping each other.
And he mentions the cooks are Mrs. Jack Stanley and Miss Jacobson.
Another use of Henry's electrical training came in his research with radio sets and transmitting. It was a real thrill to test out a small transmitting radio outfit and learn its power. But then there was no way of developing a commercial radio station out on the farm that was located far from contacts with commercial advertising. So I returned to my farm for the main source of income for living expenses, and the electrical course as a source of new interests. And here's one of his new interests. That's Henry with his Erla Reflex radio, built as a one-tube outfit in 1923. I have used the headphones, several types of loudspeakers, and a tower type of cone, which was adopted for the remainder of his time. This still operated in 1937, and he hopes to use it much longer. Of course, parts are purchased and installed from time to time. I say, Bill Winterburn, here's your radio.
Another one of his interests is wind power generation, and here he is with a 6-volt outfit on the Two Triangles farm. And he mentions that the power wires were connected to a storage battery in the radio cabinet that we saw in the previous photo.
It's pretty funky.
So the whole outfit had to be turned by hand so as to be in a favorable position to catch the wind. So he noted it wasn't very practical. But then in the background you also see the wooden receiving radio aerial tower, which is about 150 feet away. So he kept trying new things.
The third period, 1925 to 1930, marks the days of grace. But few, if none, wanted to heed the warnings from time, nor even admit that weather and financial conditions were due to change. The banks and businesses were closing down.
Here he is at the Two Triangles farm, treating fence posts with creosote to preserve them from decay. And then the nice harvesting, a binder being used to cut and elevate grain heads into the box on the wagon. And Henry's on the binder, and he notes that the elevator for the binder was homemade. So there you see another view of the putting up the load.
But meanwhile, the neighbors are getting a combine, a store-bought combine, a real thing. As we mentioned, the fellows were baptized as Lutherans and were active with many of the congregations in the area. When homesteaders would pass away, they were taken to other towns and areas of the country for burial. Finally, in 1922, the neighbors started to organize their efforts towards establishing a cemetery, and in 1926, on land donated by Ole Boe, the Emmanuel Lutheran Cemetery was dedicated. Groves were an important part of a farm in this neck of the woods. Henry often mentions the status of someone's grove. During at least 3 seasons of the year, groves were a hospitable place where picnics, meetings, and other social gatherings were held.
And he talks about this Arrowhead Park. This is his grove. And he went ahead and planted 5,000 trees, willows, and bushes by 1928, just because he loved the groves. And you can see, like, there in the distance is another grove of another person. So they planted their own trees.
Yeah.
And the Gleaner Combine, purchased in 1927, is the first combine ever to be used for harvesting on the Two Triangles farm. So he talked about the combine. He said it had to be bolted and adjusted on a Fordson tractor, which involved chain and belt drives, and it was a one-man operation. So we had a couple people came up and talked to us about this photo after our talk last fall. They were just fascinated by the fact that it was just attached
To a tractor.
To a tractor. So,
But this is what I was talking about before. This is so much smaller, and you could just harvest some ripe grain and then go over to the other ripe grain and come back to the next batch.
and he liked plants of any kind, so here he is pumping water from the slough to his strawberry plants. And then you could see Edgar weeding strawberry plants, and look at all those strawberry plants.
They mentioned how much they liked the strawberries, but seeing this huge crop, I don't know if they sold them or gave them away or just canned them all, ate them all. Looks like a lot of straws.
Here we have threshing oats in Dagmar. And we love this view because he describes it, starting at inner point, we combine out in ever-widening space, full operation by 1929. So things are looking really very good at this time.
Tower, windmill, the grove's getting tall. Lots of outbuildings.
And then here they are, grain being elevated by blower into the storage bin in 1929.
They even have bins.
And more activities in town this time. This is Dagmar, the community fair, and you can see the Dagmar Cooperative Store on the left.
There. These boys were always traveling to learn and to socialize.
Another big event they talked about was the dedication of the Fort Buford Park on July 31st, 1929. And they said North Dakota State Park near the site of the Missouri River Steamboat Landing. There were soldiers' graves in the foreground, many who were killed in action against the Indians. The Williston bands playing and the American Legion bands waiting their turn. A special program was given shortly after, and an early day prominent figure named General Hugh Scott was a special guest of honor. This is another view of it, officers' headquarters at Fort Buford, again with this same celebration in July of 1929.
And everyone came out for things. They certainly weren't alone. Unprepared for disaster, 1930 to 1940. Then, with the suddenness of a storm, we had the fourth period take us rather unprepared, and this may last until 1940. The winds did blow, and the soil started their ceaseless movement. Remember how your 1931 crops shriveled up? We sure had to eat the dust.
And we talked about the Russian thistles. This is what the Russian thistles are underneath all the dust over the fence.
They just caught it. The relief received from the state organization was of help from time to time, but according to the rules, the single persons were limited to quantities, so we just had to do without many necessary items of food. Edgar took my place on the work projects as only one person per family was allowed. I always drove to the county seat for whatever was available. I still recall having a grain sack along in which to carry away our portion of dried peas, dried beans, dried milk, and for a few times some small packages of beef. However, we received grapefruit and oranges often. I wondered if that was those Okies down in California working away. The tiresome applications first had to be made out, then we had to form in line together with many neighbors, who were quite well to do before, but after a year or two of drought ran behind with the accounts receivable, including the taxes. We also received some clothing donated by our Farmers Union Exchange, which helped out. So the Exchange of St. Paul sent clothes and shoes.
Here they are dividing up the clothes into piles to go to the different locals.
But, you know, we're the Syverud boys. We're still going to have some fun. So the Farmers Union goes on their Snake Butte picnic. Still hoping to have a good time outdoors. Crying and demanding relief, we soon started these alphabetical movements. So he's talking about the AAA and the WPA. Denying, starving, sickening, and weakening, even with an off year's temporary partial relief, many went down never to arise again. So on with loaning and patching and try to stall off the worst. Our relief work projects have been very limited, and those of the married class have been required to drive miles away to Dagmar or Coalridge or further west.
One thing that surprised us, he talks about this as being a result of the drought. Sudden cloudbursts in small areas causing the sloughs to be filled by sudden runoff. So this is looking west over the Two Triangles farm.
But, oh, there's a silver lining.
Here we have Henry.
I'll build a raft.
The sloughs are full of water, so let's build a raft. So he built a raft of poles in 1930, and he'd pull kids and their moms around in the rain-filled slough on the raft. And he mentions that the slough was not even 5 feet at the deepest. So, but he always, we love how resilient he is. He just keeps finding some fun. Again, soil erosion, he talks about cloudbursts, 1 to 3 inches of soil wash away from the cloudbursts. And this must have really made him sad because this is right near all his shrubs. He loved his Black Hill spruce and his caragana hedges and his juneberry or serviceberry bushes, all that he tended so carefully.
Here you see their neighbor Ole Baki using the horses to pull his McCormick Deering combine instead of a tractor. This was in an effort to try and save on expenses of harvesting a very light crop in 1932. And during several years, the crops were so poor that Baki just rented out his land and went to Butte and worked in the mines. Again, seeking employment options, Edgar worked on the WPA Federal Writers Project, helping to put together the Montana Guidebook. He wrote articles for the Medicine Lake Wake, yes, that was the paper, the Medicine Lake Wake, and the Producers News out of Plentywood.
The East Coalridge Community also depended on Edgar to type up the resolutions, which he also drafted. And you can see his little Oliver typewriter there in service. And he was also the writer and the photographer for most of the photos in the scrapbooks. And because of their community work, this quilt was donated to Edgar and Henry, and the names of the sponsors are sewn into the squares. So this was presented to Edgar and Henry as a Christmas present in 1931 at a Christmas program, and it was very prized. They said it was prized highly by the bachelors.
First, last, and always, the pioneer American way of life. Education was of primary interest throughout this part of the country, and the schoolhouse was often the community center. Here you see the kids and the teacher, who doesn't look much older than the kids, having their lunch. And the U.S. Mail, another part of farm life, having a rural route delivery at 30 below. So here he is with his sleigh runners on his little cab, and you can see he has a small stove inside, kind of keep him warm. You see, this is in front of the Two Triangles farm with the, whoa, wrong button. This is not always that convenient. The radio tower, the windmill. Man, snow and sleet and dark of night. Now you're going to have to stick with me on this. You might. Another project which I undertook happened in the worst drought period. My grove of trees, which I have named Arrowhead Park, has been a place where I made continuous cultivation. This grove produced a material that is and was considered a waste, such as leaves and pods. But I was struck one day with an idea that some useful purpose could be devised to use the caragana hedge seed pod. These light oak-colored pods resemble wood, so I cast about for ways and means to utilize them. The idea presented the fact that it could be used for decorating articles and objects. Hearing over my radio set that song, The Little Brown Church in the Vale, suggested to me that I could construct a small church model and fasten these pods on the outside to represent logs. For over 2 months in the winter, I made a model of the usual types of Lutheran churches, made up of cardboard with celluloid windows, but leaving the doors open. The interior had paper pews and all of the fixtures. Also put on a belfry and a steeple where I put in a small bell. Back of the church, up in the peak, I made an opening through which I inserted a light bulb and hung inside. Also inserted was a small loudspeaker unit, which I connected to my radio. Thus, I could have the church services from Lutheran Church in Wolf Point or other places come through the front doors of my model. Hence, at a little distance, looked realistic, and more so when in the evening the interior was lighted up and the room lights of my house was turned out. There was no money reward that came to me for this model, but I can truly say that I received value far above any price. So he received first place at the Granora Fair, then first place at the Northwest Fair in Minot. First prize, he was sent to the Century of Progress exhibit in the World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. It was on display there for 3 months. Came back, he refurbished it a little bit, and then he donated it to the North Dakota Historical Society in Bismarck, where it was on display for many years. They were closed for remodeling when I searched this, so I'm not sure whether it's really still on display. But
we want to find out if they still have it.
It was so realistic. Ah, yes.
Who knew you could do that with your caragana bushes? And then back to the not so pleasant activities, spreading grasshopper bait in 1934 through 1936. And he said the poison bait was supplied by Sheridan County, but he made a little note, value is in doubt, he said. See, what's it?
The drought years commencing in 1930 and continuing until 1938 was a trial for all of us. The big dust storms, as it swept in like a large blanket drawn over us from the west, made the daytime almost dark as night. The choking dust was bad, but that depended on where a person was during the worst blow. We could not be outside, so had to have the lamps lighted up during the daytime. We had to experience several dust storms in this period, and it was common to see soil drifting.
We were struck by this photograph because anybody that watched that Ken Burns special on the drought, you know, they showed scenes like this from the south, but this is one of the few views we've ever seen of this huge storm in Montana. So here we have the Farmers Union State Convention in Billings in October 19th through the 22nd in 1933. And the meetings were held at the Commercial Club room. And the banner at the right was from Sheridan County, and it was made by Edgar. And those attending delegates were Mrs. Nash, Mrs. Dahl, Ole Bow, and Henry Syverud. And Becca,
did you remember that the Walker Grill was here for a few years? If you came through that door, this big hall is on the side. You remember that you went downstairs to that restaurant? Anyway, that was probably in the 90s. Well, we had talked about the East Coalridge Community Club, which morphed into the Farmers Union local. They were together for 25 years and decided to have a celebration. So there's Henry's place up on the hill, Henry B. Syverud. Just doing their farming, faith, hope, charity.
And this is the celebration, the 25th anniversary. And Edgar Syverud was the speaker, and you can note Edgar right there on the left.
And you can see their motto here, we'll stick, we'll win.
And then they're sealing a can of records into the back of the monument. We have Leslie Dahl with the trowel and Gordon Haven with the records, again at the anniversary celebration.
From 1930 until 1934, we had little crops, so we began to look elsewhere for a place to move with opportunities to get back into some income-producing business. Edgar and Henry, with a neighbor and his wife, traveled in Henry's Model A Ford west to the Flathead Valley, but failed to locate anything favorable. So they're camping up on Logan Pass. In those days, there was a campground there, evidently. There did not seem to be any other place to go, so we had to face the situation and get along with whatever was available. Sometimes we felt to try elsewhere, but after an investigating trip or two, we have to admit to being licked. Then, as the years roll on, we see less and less chance to sell for anything, and new opportunities have evaporated. Kinda. Here's evaporation. This is a pile of sodium sulfate that was gathered from a lake bottom, and once the water has evaporated, you've got Glauber salts. So this was raked up into piles along the lake, and in this neck of the woods it was 98% pure. So it's not snow or ice, it's just resembles coarse salt. Oscar Quorn, their friend, had discovered this while out hunting ducks in 1908. But in 1934, the Federal Emergency Relief people helped them to develop it so that they would have another opportunity to make some money in this terrible time. The sodium sulfate lakes are about 6 miles northwest of Grenora, just almost in Montana. Another project I was called on to promote during these years was to start a farmers' union oil station at Grenora. We sold shares but could not get enough money, so had to return every cent of our own expense and stand the loss of collecting too. The next year they tried again and got loans from the Farmers Union Central Exchange, as well as collecting shares from all the neighbors. They had enough to buy out the competitor, which resulted in a lot of political fallout, but the setup turned out to be very successful, and Henry was elected a director and an officer. This oil station was completely paid for by patronage dividends by the end of year 1936, so just 2 years to pay it off. And here are the board of directors. Henry's in the middle, in the coveralls. And he wasn't just a director, he was a patron. Here they are filling up his oil barrels. Among my hobbies are the collecting of specimens and curios, rocks and minerals. Other absorbing interests are getting historical facts about communities wherever we may travel. With the aid of cameras and Kodaks, we are sure to capture scenes, the folks that you and I know, and the hobbies.
He mentions Writing Rock number 1 as he saw it in June of 1919. And he mentioned later that the rock had been purchased by the North Dakota State Historical Society together with a 10-acre plot for a park area. And Henry, with the assistance of his brother Edgar, had worked to get this purchased, and this was done in October of 1936. So he was kind of dismayed, though, because the inscriptions on Writing on the Rock were not clearly defined. And so he didn't know what the patterns were, so he requested Edward Milligan to draw in whatever inscriptions that he could identify as possible Indian origin. He used red chalk to mark other lines, dents, etc., that he could not connect with any known symbols. So these were the other ones he just left unmarked, but we think this would just make archaeologists crazy. He's so busy, you know, preserving the rock, but at the same time, he's painting in the parts you couldn't see.
In places where the topsoil had blown away, I found many arrow points, stone knives, hammers, and flint trading stock. I had never found any arrow points before the drought in my fields, though I had cultivated and traveled over the same area repeatedly for 20 years. So there's some advantage to having all your soil blow away, I guess. From this, I made up mounted collections of arrow points, some very good points, some broken, but I have thus a great record of a prior race having lived in our area.
We love this photo because it kind of shows all the combinations. You have the Danish Brotherhood and the Farmers Union, and they're having their convention in Sheridan County, and it's just a great photo of people, too. And of course, there's always work. Here's the completion of the Syverud Dam. Work done by Edgar and Henry. The dam's 160 feet long at the top. It's also 6 feet wide at the top. And he said the rip-wrapping alone took 2 months, hauling up large glacial boulders.
These guys are getting older. I mean, gee, 2 years hauling rock.
Edgar and Henry built a dam and laid out several diversion ditches. They applied for aid in surveying these projects through their local county extension agent and received splendid cooperation. The demonstration tours set the examples for which we applied remedies for our particular needs and to fit available funds. So they were interested, in this case, in soil erosion control.
As you see here, the Syveruds are ready to face the future. Henry says, but as long as life and hope still smolders, we hope to start the next period with a new spirit, even with the burdens of drought and depression periods hanging on us like old sores. Thus you have the picture of 30 years of living through it.
We, we're not going to, we have just one more slide, really. But we wanted to remind you there are 2 more volumes that we didn't use in our talk because Henry didn't die till 1965 and Edgar in 66. So they went on collecting and gathering information about their place in the world, and there's a lot more of wonderful photos and information that they shared.
I'd like to read another one of Henry's brief messages, kind of justifying his life's work. The preservation of records, materials, and antiques is an age-old custom, highly valuable even to our speedy age, because of the valuable evidence presented, thus providing signs of progress or dangerous downfall of civilization. This, in future research work, will place its importance on a very high plane, so every bit that can be preserved should be done at once. We are highly indebted to those living here before us who have done so much of this preservation of things, giving their light on their lives. As we close, I'd like to have Lory read a little benediction that Henry offered in the Haven News in 1937.
I expect to pass this way through our world but once. Therefore, any good that I might do and have the grace to say may comfort and encourage a neighbor who comes this way. Some material record may again revive the lost or drooping spirit to action and play, and thereby save from destruction and decay.